Over to you. Thank you so much, Chairman. And I want to build on the presentations that have been made. It's a rather very wide subject, and I chose to speak about one thing. I think the biggest question we've been having is, must the information to the adolescents be comprehensive or not? And this has been a subject that has disturbed the African continent in many ways. Allow me share the experience of Uganda in 2016, where we had several events that have shaped the conversation on the policy choices that we need to think about. And I'm specifically sharing this because the Parliament in Uganda had a major role to play in the conversations around whether the education that is given on sexuality is comprehensive or not. Sometime in April 2016, the Ministry of Education and Sports issued a circular, which they called Circular Number 5. It called upon the Chief Administrative Officers, the District Education Officers, the District Inspectors of Schools, and the heads of schools at all levels to be mindful that groups were in communities sharing information. And the ministry was concerned that the number of organizations and individuals that were actually giving materials had increased, but they were giving materials without the permission of the ministry. But they were also concerned that the materials that were being given were contravening the regulations of the government of Uganda. And they asked them to ensure that any organization that was found doing that, it needs to be put to stop immediately. A few months down the road, in August, on 16th, the Parliament of Uganda was up in arms, and they had a hot conversation following media reports that a parent had found a child with a textbook, and that textbook had sexual materials. And the sexual materials were going beyond what was acceptable, and Parliament thought that this was not something that was tenable within our society. So the MPs passed a motion, and they tasked government to ban dissemination of sexual education in all schools with immediate effect. This later on was picked up by the Ministry of Gender. Now, I'm mentioning three ministries or three entities of government: the Ministry of Education and Sports, the Parliament of Uganda, and later on the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development. It announced a ban that everywhere on the Ugandan soil there should never be sexuality education that is being disseminated by organizations. And they argued in their press release that this education was poisoning the minds of the young people, and it was never African. I am a lawyer that has done health systems work for years. I was left perturbed by the decisions of the different ministries. First, they were banning something they had never regulated, and they were making references to regulations of the government of Uganda which were never existing. So an NGO picked up a case on 18th November, and they ran to the High Court under miscellaneous cause 309 of 2016. And their argument was on not the quality of information shared, but was on the actions of Parliament and the actions of the Minister of Education. They simply made three arguments before the courts of law. That the inordinate delay and omission to pass a policy on comprehensive sexuality education violated the rights of access to information and the right to education, as argument number one. Argument number two was that the order quashing and putting a ban on comprehensive sexuality education by all these government entities was illegal, because they were trying to ban something that had never been regulated. You can't ban what you've not regulated. And they were asking for third order, that the ministry had to be asked to come up with a policy that regulates sexuality education within 1 month. So a case was filed before the High Court. A few weeks after filing it, an organization expressed interest to join the response of government. So this was a faith-based organization, and it was pushing back on the case that the other NGO had filed. And they applied to join. Court granted them to join. And they asked for two issues to be added for consideration. The first was for court to pronounce that the current conversation and the content proposed on comprehensive sexuality education by UNESCO was not culturally, socially, and religiously appropriate. And the second issue was that the rolling out of comprehensive sexuality education in schools without the involvement and approval of parents by some organizations was illegal. The Attorney General has to respond to all of these allegations. So on behalf of the Minister of Education, the Attorney General responded that yes, it is true, under the Education Act, the ministry is empowered to initiate policies and reforms in the education sector. But this has to be done when the need arises. And the Attorney General had found that there was no need for the spreading or passing of a policy yet of comprehensive sexuality education. As issue now, response number one. Response number two was that the Attorney General was also not convinced with the current confusion on ideological thinking on comprehensive sexuality education. And therefore, the ministry had no understanding of any analysis that had been done to show that actually a policy on comprehensive sexuality education was important. And he raised the third argument that it was equally not true that the NGO had actually made a case that when information is shared, there is reduction in HIV/AIDS, because the Attorney General had observed that in other jurisdictions like South Africa, where this policy is existing, the HIV/AIDS infections had not gone down. This case is before a judge, and she had to make a decision. She was a lady judge, justice, who delivered a decision in November 2020. She observed that the applicant had made a case not on the quality of education shared, but it was on the issue of banning what is not regulated. She also observed that the interested party, the religious group which had responded, had very well sounding claims, but they had no evidence to prove them. And she noted that Uganda was a party to international, regional, and other international covenants, which created obligations on the country to pass policies that regulate sexuality education. On the issue of whether the education in Uganda should be comprehensive or not, she said the term comprehensive is a simple matter of form, which makes us move away from the question of the substance of sexuality education. So in her findings, she found no justification for the delay of passing a comprehensive sexuality education policy in Uganda, and she directed the Ministry of Education to immediately draft a comprehensive sexuality education after consulting stakeholders, and she directed that the policy must be completed within 2 years, with the ministry reporting on the progress to the registrar of court every after 6 months. This is a judgment that we got in Uganda in 2020. Now, it is important for Parliament to think about some of these conversations, because as Professor Osul has indicated, it is a contestation between the young people and the older generation, and I like the way you put the sections. We are coming from pre-colonial to colonial and post-colonial periods. I only want to add one generation, which is Generation X. It sees things differently, and Mr. Chairman, I'm concluding, but I'm cutting out the work for Parliament. Parliament doesn't make policies, but it develops laws. I have observed that the policy processes are too slow from the executive. And the Ugandan Parliament, one time, the former speaker went on the floor of Parliament and had a whole conversation one afternoon on why the school health policy has never been passed. Uganda has been making a school health policy for the last 22 years. They began drafting the school health policy 22 years ago. It has never been passed. The adolescents' health policies are for review. The review process has been ongoing. It has not been passed. Same for the policy on sexual reproductive health and rights. This is work of the executive, but certainly as part of the oversight role of Parliament, this has to be thought, and Parliament has to pick interest in some of the policies that are relevant and yet controversial. The traditional approaches of providing sexuality education are clearly engraved. In the community where I come from, the aunties, we call sengas, and the uncles used to invite the young people and give them the education. Now the aunties and the uncles fear them. And it's on the government to really ensure that the regulatory function is picked up. If there is no regulation that is happening, we are certainly leaving a vacuum that needs to be thought about. So the role of Parliament in oversight is very important on policy processes, especially on the contested issues of sexual reproductive health and rights. The question of age has remained a colonial issue. The definition of appropriate age and the definition of what is culturally appropriate has never been done. I would be interested in the case that the issues of the faith-based group that they raised. What amounts to cultural appropriateness of education in Africa or in our societies? We've not answered that. We need frameworks to actually answer some of these things, rather than arguing in the broad sense that things are not appropriate. What is appropriate? We've not taken the steps that we are supposed to be taking. I would go on and on and on, but let me stop there, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.